Okay, following from my Instagram posts recently about using a needle gauge to choose what size needle I want for working a project, I was asked if I could do a bit more of an explanatory video. So I'm going to demonstrate with a selection of, well, most of this is hand spun, because I typically find this method most useful for hand spun, because if your hand spun's like mine, it's not always exactly even, or else you just aren't, I mean, you can check your reps per inch, but because it's a bit more unique, mine tends to be a bit more woolen, a bit more fluffy. I wouldn't necessarily use the same needle gauge for some of my hand spun as I would for the equivalent weight of commercial spun that tends to have a lot, I put a fairly tight twist, so it's not about the twist, but about how it fills in space. So for this example, I have a crochet hook. This is actually my sort of emergency go-to little one with two ends. One's 2mm, one's 3.5mm, and it'll just help me pull the yarns through the holes. So this yarn here, for example, is about an Aran worsted weight, and obviously I wouldn't knit it with a 2mm. Well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously. Maybe in some strange circumstance I would, but pretty unlikely. And then this one, I would probably guess to start at least a 4.5mm personally. Just thinking about what I typically use for this kind of a weight. So just to get an idea of how, if that would be my ideal, when I pull my yarn through my needle gauge, I can have a really good sense of, it's kind of this reverse thing that works. So you can see how it fills the space. And so there's still, it's fairly, I can tell that there's a lot of, it's having to smush a little more when I work with a 4.5mm hole. And if you aren't already aware, when we're looking at these measurements, this is actually the diameter. That is the measurement. So to be honest, with this yarn, I'd probably go for something. I think I like how the stitches look, how the yarn looks, the density there, in a 5mm to start. And I know I'm only sampling one section of my yarn here. I'm actually pulling out a bit thicker, and then it goes a bit more with my average below it. 5.5 is pretty good, but for comparison purposes, you know, if I went up to a 9mm needle, I'd be making pretty giant stitches, obviously, and there'd be a lot of space, and that's not usually ever my ideal with a yarn like this, personally. But I might consider it with this bulkier yarn that I spun. I actually very rarely use 9mm. I'd probably be more realistically going to go for a 7mm. Oh, I like how that fills in. But then to demonstrate, if I went down to a 6mm, to me that's starting to push the yarns together a little bit more than I would prefer with this yarn. I don't think it would show off its strange plying options. This one is a yarn that I didn't spin, it was gifted to me. And so this is an example of a situation where I would look at a yarn and be pretty uncertain what needle I might want to use. So I've got, there's a fair difference between some of this. Not that bad actually when I put it side by side. Looking at this smallest piece here and this. Okay, well that's a decent size difference. So I would probably want to sample, you know, without expecting to be able to get to all sections of it. I'm going to guess in the mid-range, in the 4mm, 4.5 range. So I'm going to have a look and see what does my, sorry, trying to do this and hold the camera at the same time. Okay. So at the 4mm range, that definitely has a decent amount of space. So that would be nice. I could do 4mm for that. It would definitely have more airy space because that's more of the fingering weight range on that section. And if I pull through some of the thicker, I can see it would definitely be more dense there. You know, probably typically I might go up more to a 4.5 for a thicker yarn like that. But if I used a 4.5 on the thinner area, I personally wouldn't like it as much. You can see there's a lot more empty space. So I'd probably go 4mm and be pretty happy that I would like it for most of the yarn. And then I would like the different textures. This one's more of a lace weight. So again, you know, when you see your lace weights, it can start getting hard. This does not exempt you from actually swatching, but I find it does help to give me a starting point. I'm going to grab a thicker part of my lace. So this part is a bit heftier. Oh, you're not focused there. Come on, camera. Then the one next to it, for example, I can see. I'm going to go with the thicker because that's going to be my more concerned. That would be too dense for me. I'm going to have difficulty pulling. There we go. Through with the 2mm. So at 2.25mm on my thicker, to me that's a bit dense. And typically, of course, I wouldn't really work lace. I'll be honest, I probably start my lace work at about a 3mm would be my minimum for lace. Because I like it fairly open. Even on my thickest, I find that would be a lovely tight. I actually really love 3.5mm needles. I don't know why. They're just a nice size for a lace weight. Yeah, so I'd probably like that one, and then grabbing some of this slightly thinner area, and I'm gonna regret this later when I look at my not so pretty skein anymore. You can see that definitely there's more space there around the yarns, but I'm okay with that for my lace. I like it quite open. So that pretty much just confirms what I already knew. I really like how it looks with something in the 3.5 to 3.75mm range. This one's a single, so it's even finer than my 3-ply. So I would start to actually have concerns about would I even want to go as high as a 3.5mm with this weight of yarn, even though I like 3.5 for lace. And I know that a single will bloom. I'm still not convinced on the 3.5. So I might just look at how it comes together, how these end up pushing together. I'd probably go down to a 3.25. So there we go. That's some examples of how I would use a needle gauge to start guesstimating what I like, the look of my yarns when I'm going to knit them up with different sized needles. And some of it, I mean, you might just guess, or you're experienced enough, of course, to just figure out what yarns go with what needles based on your own experience. But, you know, if you want a little help eyeballing it, especially when it's a yarn that's different, or especially different construction for hand-spun yarns, you know, this is just another helpful tool to have in your kit. Something different to evaluate your yarns. And it doesn't have to be just hand-spun yarns, but any yarns that you're picking up or you're not familiar with, because with different fiber types and different ways of spinning, even commercially, you result in different yarns. And, you know, if it's not one that you're familiar with, you might want to look at how how the stitches fill a certain space based on needle size. I hope that helps. And you can pick these up at the Manitoba Fibre Festival, of course. That is September 14th and 15th at the Red River Exhibition Grounds. And they will be there, and they're really pretty. I like them. Thanks.